Hi everyone, I hope you guys are having a great day. So today we are going to pick up where we left off last time. We're going to finish up the slides on love and attraction, and then we will also introduce the prejudice slides today. And then next week we'll be finishing up those prejudice slides. So if you have any questions about the material for today, let me know, please. Feel free to email me or come by my office hours. However, you do not have an activity this week. So all you'll need to do is watch the lecture video and just let me know if you have any questions. I also wanted to remind everyone about signing up to take the proctored exam for exam 4. So remember that I'm having you take this proctored exam not just because it's going to be password protected, but also because MUW requires students who are taking an online class to verify their identity. So if you do not do this, you will not pass the class regardless of what your grade is. So please make sure that you make an appointment to take the test at some point while it's open. I think it's open from May 2nd to May 6th. So check the syllabus. Let me know if you need any help with this or you have any questions. So make sure to take exam 4 as the proctored exam. Okay? So let's go ahead and get into lecture today. Alright, so last week we started talking about love and attraction, and we started off with attraction because we were talking about how relationships develop and how they begin. And then we moved into talking about the different kinds of love, companionate love versus passionate love. Now, picking up where we left off last time, the first thing we're going to talk about today would be attachment styles. So attachment styles, it says, the expectations people develop about relationships with others based on their relationship they had typically with their primary caregiver when they were infants or young children. So without getting too Freudian on you guys here, the idea is that the relationships that we have with our parents or with whoever is caring for us when we're very young, they're very important relationships because they tell us something about what to expect from future relationships. For example, they tell us whether or not we are worthy of love or whether or not other people see us in a positive way. And so some children who, as you'll see, have had really good relationships and really good support will learn to have healthy, appropriate expectations for future relationships. Unfortunately, though, some individuals who have had less than optimal parenting may develop some of these other attachment styles that can be harmful or negative to their future relationships. Although, as we'll talk about, just because someone has less than optimal attachment style does not mean that they cannot have a successful relationship. But typically when we talk about attachment styles, we're talking about 3: secure, anxious, ambivalent, and avoidant. And keep in mind that the attachment style that you have in one relationship might be different from the attachment style you have in a different relationship depending on the partner, depending on how you change, how things change as you age, right? That our attachment styles are not necessarily going to be predictive of our future relationships, but they are to a certain degree. So let's get into this a little bit more so that I can kind of explain to you guys about what attachment styles are. So first of all, secure attachment styles. As you might imagine, these are the attachment styles that we all wish that we had, right? Secure attachment styles characterized by trust, a lack of concern with being abandoned, and the view that one is worthy and well-liked. So, secure attachment styles typically develop when a child has had consistent, appropriate affection from parents or caregivers. So, parents who have perhaps been authoritative in their parenting, so providing discipline and structure, consistency, as well as providing affection, are more likely to have children that have secure attachment styles. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that everyone who had ideal parenting has a secure attachment style, but there is a relationship here. So typically, if children receive high-quality parenting, they're more likely to have a secure attachment style. This means that as they grow up and as they develop other kinds of relationships, they were not likely to be afraid of commitment and not likely to be afraid of having the person abandon them, for example. They're more likely to seek out partners for long-term committed relationships and more likely to be satisfied in their relationships. So I wish that we were all this lucky, right? However, there are a couple of other attachment styles. So first of all, anxious ambivalent attachment style is an attachment style characterized by a concern that others will not reciprocate our desire for intimacy, resulting in higher than average levels of anxiety. So what typically happens with an anxious or ambivalent attachment style is that you see someone who is very clingy, perhaps. Someone who is very, very nervous about their partner leaving them, or someone who needs constant reassurance that their partner has affection for them. So you may know these people, or at some point in time you may have been these individuals. You may be now, right? The thing about anxious ambivalent styles is that they often develop when individuals receive inconsistent parenting. So maybe sometimes the parents were available and they were warm and they were affectionate, and sometimes they were cold and distant. So then the individual learned that they can't really predict how someone else will feel. They'll become uncomfortable in close relationships and anxious because they'll be afraid that perhaps the individual will stop caring for them or will stop showing them affection. So these individuals tend to need a little bit more reassurance from their partners. Right now, this could still be an individual who has a healthy relationship. If their partner understands and shows them love and shows them affection, then over time you may become more secure in your relationship. But this is one way that attachment styles can go wrong. The other way is an avoidant attachment style. So an avoidant attachment style is characterized by a suppression of attachment needs because attempts to have been intimate have been rebuffed. In other words, someone who has an avoidant attachment style probably as a child or in those first early relationships didn't get a lot of affection at all. So someone who has this anxious ambivalent style is someone who might have received attention sometimes and sometimes did not, or affection. Then this individual who has an avoidant attachment style, it's likely that they may not have received much affection at all. So then if they have learned from early relationships that they're not going to receive affection, then that might make them hesitant to try to have a close relationship later in life, and therefore might have commitment issues. Now think about this for a second. Is there a stereotypical gender pattern to attachment styles? Typically, perhaps we think of women as being more likely to have that anxious, ambivalent, clingy style. Often we think about men having this avoidant attachment style, being afraid of commitment. Now, that's not necessarily the way it is for everyone. There are certainly women who have avoidant attachment styles and men who have anxious, ambivalent styles. But I wonder if perhaps we haven't created this by the way that we parent boys and girls differently. About how perhaps girls are more likely to have had at least some affection, whereas oftentimes when parents are parenting boys, they don't give as much affection. It's kind of that, you fell, rub some dirt in it, boys don't cry, be a man kind of thing. And perhaps then we create these differences in attachment styles. And just a thought that I have. I don't have any research to back that up, but it's just a thought about how we could have perhaps created these issues. Alright, so a lot of us don't necessarily have secure attachment styles. So what does that mean for us? Well, if people had unhappy relationships with their parents, that does not necessarily mean that they will never be able to have healthy relationships, right? It is possible for a person to change their attachment style over time from one relationship to the next. So maybe you were in a relationship where it was not a healthy relationship and you had an avoidant or anxious attachment style, but then you went into a different relationship and that person was a better partner and you developed a more secure style. So attachment styles can change. It's also possible to have more than one attachment style at a time. So perhaps someone is typically secure but a little bit avoidant, or typically secure but a little bit anxious, or maybe some combination of avoidant and anxious, right? So you can have more than one going on at one time, and your attachment styles can change. Alright, so there are some other theories that we need to talk about before we finish the relationships and love and attraction slides. First of all, social exchange theory. The idea that people's feelings about a relationship depend on perceptions of rewards and costs, the kind of relationship they deserve, so their expectations, and their chance for having a better relationship with someone else. So the idea behind social exchange theory is that relationships are sort of like anything else, sort of almost like, well, this is an economic model that's almost like business, right? You kind of make a pros and cons list, and that helps you decide what to do. Now, we often don't think about relationships that way, in that kind of like cold, detached, logical way, but maybe deep down this does motivate us. In any relationship, you have rewards. You have things that you enjoy, otherwise you wouldn't be in that relationship. But also in any relationship you have costs, right? So maybe the rewards are that you have perhaps affection and you have support and you have love and you have someone to talk to, right? But the costs are that you lose some of your own independence. You don't necessarily get to do all the things that you want to do, that you have to be responsible for another person. Whatever the case may be, any relationship is going to have rewards and costs. We're also going to have expectations about the kind of relationship that we deserve. I remember hearing, I haven't seen this movie, but I remember seeing a preview for a movie once that said, we accept the love we think we deserve. So, if you know what movie that's from, let me know. But the idea is that if we have high expectations, then perhaps that influences the way that we approach our relationship versus someone who had lower expectations, right? And then finally, our chances for finding something better somewhere else. So if we feel like we're not necessarily happy where we are, but we're not likely to find anything better, then we might be likely to stay in that relationship versus if we feel like we have a good chance of finding something better. Okay? So the social exchange theory, it really is a kind of cold, calculating way of thinking about relationships, but maybe you've done this before. Maybe you've thought about the rewards and the costs, right? It says rewards are the positive, gratifying aspects, the things that we enjoy about relationships. Costs are the negative aspects of relationships, the things that we have to give up. So basically, we think about what is the total outcome based on a comparison of rewards versus costs. Now, it's not just necessarily the number of rewards versus the number of costs, right? It's not like, okay, well, I had 5 rewards and I had 6 costs, so bye-bye. It's not necessarily like that. It's also perhaps how serious the reward and the cost is. It could be that there's only one reward and lots of costs, but you really feel like that one reward is very important to you. Perhaps, on the other hand, it's all rewards except for one cost, but that one cost is a deal breaker for you. Perhaps we have deal breakers. You know, I asked you guys last week to think about what you were looking for in a relationship and list the things that you wanted, but maybe perhaps you also have a list of things that you don't want or things that you would not accept, right? So it's not necessarily as straightforward as it sounds, but basically we tend to stay in relationships when the rewards outweigh or outnumber the costs, right? Not sure why these slides are loading so slowly. All right. So another theory about relationships is called equity theory, and this is going to sound very common sense. The idea that people are happiest in their relationships when the rewards and the costs experienced and both parties' contributions are roughly equal. In other words, equity theory basically says that you're most likely to be happy in a relationship if you and your partner are contributing the same amount of effort. Now, sometimes you hear about how in relationships you're each supposed to give 50-50, probably more like 100-100, because we know relationships are hard work. But with equity theory, the idea is that as long as both partners at least feel like the other partner is contributing an equal amount, then they feel pretty happy there. But maybe perhaps you've been in a relationship that was inequitable, or you've seen someone that you know be in a relationship that's inequitable. Typically, the partners, if it stays that way for very long, they're not very happy. They lose their satisfaction over time, because if one partner is doing all the work and the other partner isn't doing anything, both partners are likely to end up unhappy at some point. Although the partner doing most of the work is likely to be the one that gets unhappy first. So equitable relationships are the happiest and the most stable. So if you're in a relationship where both partners are contributing roughly equal amounts of effort, then it's most likely to continue that relationship. Although sometimes it is hard to think about what makes something equitable or one person's contribution equal to another. For example, what if one partner works outside of the home all day and the other partner stays at home with the kids all day? Can you say that that's equal? Maybe one partner feels like they're doing more than the other partner. Maybe there is some kind of difficulty coming to a consensus about what is equity, right? Who should be doing what? And so a lot of really important communication and potential conflict can come up there when we're trying to figure out what is equitable. And so there's no one right answer for all couples, but just, I guess the answer is an equitable relationship is when both partners are happy and satisfied with their own and their partner's contributions. So if we have an inequitable relationship that's basically not fair, then one person is going to feel over-benefited. They've got lots of rewards and few costs. They're not putting a whole lot into the relationship, but they're getting a whole lot out of it. Now, on first glance here, it might seem like it's a lot of fun to be the one that's over-benefited, right? Because you're not having to do anything. You're having everything done for you. However, think about how this could get old very quickly. If for no other reason than the fact that if you are not doing anything, your partner is likely to be unhappy with you. And therefore, that's going to make your life more difficult. So this person may eventually become unhappy. And so then they need to start contributing more to the relationship. But if one partner is over-benefited, then we also have one partner who is under-benefited. This is the individual who's doing all the work, right? Few rewards, high costs. They're putting a lot of time and energy into it, and they're putting a lot of effort into it, but they don't feel like they're getting much back. Now, inequity is more important to the person who's under-benefited. This person is more likely to be upset, and they're probably going to get upset sooner than the person who is over-benefited, although both partners may end up unhappy. So ask yourself, what would you do in this situation if you were in a relationship that was not equitable? Some people would leave and just give up on the relationship. Some people would stay and try to get the other partner to contribute more. Another option might be that some people just kind of try to balance or try to restore psychological equity, where they start to feel like both partners. They try to convince themselves that their partner is doing more than they really are, right? But there's some need here for a balance. And so we either have to find that balance or perhaps abandon the relationship altogether. So, talking about abandoning relationships, American divorce rate is nearly 50%, so flip a coin. It's about 50% of the current marriage rate. Now, it's a lot easier to do research on divorce rate versus, for example, couples that are dating, breaking up, because we actually have some paperwork involved here. But we know that romantic relationships end every day. So, why is it that the divorce rate is so high? Well, I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm trying to keep you guys' attention, try to keep these lectures brief. So I'll be brief here. We live in an individualistic society where we tend to look out for ourselves and we tend to focus less on our families. I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, I'm just saying that that's the way that it is. In collectivist cultures, their divorce rate is typically a lot lower. Now, that could just be because people who maybe are unhappy and would get a divorce if they felt like they could have a lot of barriers to divorce. Like, for example, there's more of like a social taboo. So that's certainly possible. Or it's more possible that when your emphasis is more on the family, then you're more likely to be doing the behaviors that maintain a healthy relationship. So it could be something culturally related. Also, we know that over time, that even in this country, the taboo against divorce used to be much stronger. And so today there are not as many barriers to divorce. It's easier, it is more accessible, it's less looked down upon, I think, than it used to be. And so perhaps that is the reason, part of the reason for the divorce rate. Also, maybe because gender roles are changing and couples may have a difficult time navigating that. So there are a lot of potential reasons for why this happens, but we know that the divorce rate is just about 50%. So one thing I wanted to note before we finish the love and attraction slides, and we're talking about couples breaking up. Interesting note here, 30% of breakups, the qualities that attracted them most are the ones that they dislike most when they break up. This is called fatal attraction. In this situation, something that you liked about the person when you first got together with them is actually the reason that you break up with them, or the thing that makes you most unhappy when the relationship dissolves. Maybe, for example, you used to love how spontaneous a person was, and then after time you start to say, wow, this person never plans anything, right? Or you used to love how laid back they were, until the bills don't get paid. Or maybe perhaps you loved how organized they were until they woke you up at 6 o'clock in the morning to make the bed, right? At some point, something that you liked about them, the more time you spend with them becomes a problem. So this is called fatal attraction. Alright, so that is the end of the love and attraction slides. Today I am also going to introduce prejudice. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is and where it comes from and some things that we can do to try to decrease prejudice. Okay? Alright, so prejudice, starting off with the definition, a hostile or negative attitude toward people in a distinguishable group based solely on their membership in that group. Now, you'll see this in a later slide. It doesn't necessarily have to be a hostile or negative attitude, although typically it is, and typically that's what we think of when we think of prejudice. But really what it is treating someone a certain way because they are part of a group. It doesn't matter if you're doing it for a positive reason or a negative reason. You're treating this person this way because they're a member of that group. And that's nothing else that's influencing the way that you're treating them, right? So, for example, perhaps if you say, I'm treating this person a certain way because of their gender or because of their race, and we're going to talk about several potential characteristics that can cause someone to experience prejudice. But prejudice just means that we treat someone a certain way. It's basically that we feel like we know something about someone because of a group membership. But of course, just because someone belongs to a certain group doesn't mean that we know anything about them. But I think that we do this because we're lazy and because it saves time. And if we feel like we already know something about them, then we don't have to get to know them and learn more, and we don't have to put forth that effort. So, when we're talking about prejudice, it is ubiquitous. In other words, it affects all of us. Now, we don't want to think this. We want to think that we're not prejudiced. We want to think that we're totally open-minded, but everyone has some kind of bias. And when I was in graduate school taking intelligence testing, my professor encouraged us to think about what our biases are so that we could be prepared in a situation when we see that maybe perhaps something here is going to set off a bias to actively try to prevent that, right? So it's important to know our biases that we have, but prejudice affects everyone. We can't help but have feelings towards someone. Maybe if you're a sports fan, you really don't like the fans of another team or a rival team, right? You don't even know them, but you feel strongly against them because there's something about your team versus their team that creates this group membership, whatever the case may be. Now, prejudice can come in any direction. It can come from the minority group to the majority group, or from the majority group to the minority group, right? But it's just, as you'll see later and probably talk more about next week, prejudice happens when we start putting people into groups. And then we have this belief that my group is different from your group and my group is better than your group. And we start having this, this belief or this prejudice about someone based on their group membership solely. Now, any group can be a target of prejudice because, as I said, the most important characteristic of something being prejudiced is that we have a group membership, that we've put them in a category, right? So any group can be a target. So we're going to talk about some things that are part of your identity that can cause you to be labeled and discriminated against. Now, this first slide has the ones that maybe perhaps we think about most often. Nationality, racial and ethnic identity, gender, sexual orientation. You see these most often. We talk about these in the news, we talk about these in class, and this kind of prejudice is one that we think about the most. But we might not realize that there are other potential aspects of who you are and aspects of your identity that can cause you to be discriminated against. So you'll see on the next couple of slides that just about anything that labels a person or that puts them in some kind of group can cause a prejudice, right? So in addition to those, we also have like religion, appearance, physical state, so referring to like health here, weight. One thing we already talked about with appearance, we were talking about that kind of what is beautiful is good stereotype, and we'll talk about stereotypes later, but that idea that people who are physically attractive have other characteristics, that is a prejudice, even though it's perhaps a positive prejudice when we're assigning something good to them. It's making a judgment about someone because of their group membership. Can you really tell very much about a person based on their looks? We talked about how with that particular what is beautiful is good stereotype, that there was a small amount of truth there, that there were some things that were true, like for example that people who are more attractive tended to have better social skills, mostly just because of the way that people treat them. So there may be some very small grains of truth here, but for the most part, you really don't know much about a person based on these things. Also, in addition to those, disabilities, diseases, hair color. Do blondes really have more fun? I don't know. I'm a brunette. I've always been a brunette. Professions, hobbies. So perhaps maybe there are some professions that we look down upon, and maybe there are some professions that we look up to. And it's just assuming that anyone who is in that profession is a certain way, right? So maybe like, for example, sometimes people have very negative thoughts and beliefs about politicians. And we lump all, and I've been guilty of this myself, and we lump all politicians into one group. I don't like any of them. I don't trust any of them, right? But we don't know these people, right? There could be good politicians out there, right? I want to believe so anyway. Very good. Or maybe perhaps we have very positive beliefs, like doctors. We look up to doctors, but there's potentially some bad doctors out there, right? So just because we know someone's profession doesn't necessarily mean we know that much about them. Hobbies, perhaps. There may be some hobbies that we look up to, like perhaps athletes, could be a profession or a hobby depending on the situation. There may be some hobbies that we look down on. So there are a lot of things that can cause you to be discriminated against. So we're going to talk about the types of prejudice in a moment. But before we get into that, I do want to just say that prejudice can be dangerous. Now, I said that prejudice impacts all of us. So prejudice is often not dangerous if we don't act on it. However, we can look back on our history and we can see that there have been times when prejudice has been extremely dangerous, escalating to hatred, torture, murder, genocide. You think about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, for example. Extremely dangerous situation here. But that's, of course, really, really horrible. But another consequence, and we'll talk about more consequences either this week or next week, but one consequence is that it hurts a person's self-esteem. And when we're talking about something like torture and murder versus hurting someone's self-esteem, it makes it seem like it's less serious, but it's still a very important part of a person. That self-esteem, it's related to a lot of things, including things like depression. So when someone maybe hears things about themselves over and over again from people who maybe don't even know them, then it starts to change the way they see themselves, which can create that negative self-fulfilling prophecy. But we'll talk more about that later. So prejudice is dangerous, so that's why it's important for us to have these conversations so we can talk about how we can change it, right? Now, prejudice is an attitude. That means that we have to think back to our earlier lectures from the semester about attitudes. So we said that attitudes had three components, ABC, right? Affective, behavioral, and cognitive. So the affective part, if you remember, is an emotional component. So affective prejudice is all about how you feel around someone. So it could be positive, could be negative here. Maybe just because this person is in a certain group, you like them, you want to be around them, like for example, a celebrity perhaps. It could also be that just because someone is in a group, you feel anger towards them or you feel uncomfortable around them. It could be something as mild as just a little bit feeling uneasy around the person. Maybe you don't know what to say to them, you're afraid of offending them, that kind of thing. But it could also go all the way to being extremely hostile toward that other person. So the affective is that emotional component. Now, sometimes we can see this emotional prejudice. Sometimes we can see it on their face. Sometimes we can tell. But other times we may not know what someone else is feeling. We might not know that this affective prejudice is happening. Okay, so then the B is going to be the behavioral component, and we'll talk about how later this is discrimination. So it's how people act on their emotions and their cognitions. And typically we can see the behavioral component. We can see what people do. And this is where it can become dangerous. Feeling uncomfortable around a certain group of people doesn't necessarily lead you to mistreating them. However, when we get to the behavioral component, people start acting on those emotions and on these cognitions that we'll talk about in a second. That's when the dangerous things can happen. And then finally, that cognitive component, if you'll remember, a cognition is just a thought or a belief. So when we're talking about the cognitive component, we're talking about stereotypes here. Beliefs are thoughts that make up the attitude. So it's the things that we believe about them, which could be positive or negative, that cause us to put them in this certain category, right? So we know that all three components of prejudice are important. Now, as I've been alluding to throughout this lecture, we usually think of a prejudice as being a negative attitude, but it could also be a positive attitude as well, right? So, for example, maybe with athletes, maybe we have high expectations and high beliefs. I don't know if you guys know who Aaron Hernandez is, if you're NFL fans. Aaron Hernandez was a New England Patriots player who has been, I'm not sure, I haven't followed it closely enough to know whether or not he's been convicted. I know he was charged, I think he's been convicted of some murders. And I heard someone call into a radio station and talk about how he was so upset about Aaron Hernandez because his son looked up to Aaron Hernandez, and Aaron Hernandez was his son's hero because he was an NFL player. We maybe have expectations about people because they're a celebrity or because they're a professional athlete. We maybe have a positive prejudice where even though we don't know them, because they're in a certain group, we think that they're better than other people, that there's something good about them. But prejudice in general can be a problem, even if it's positive prejudice, because we can be mistaken there, right? As obviously was the case with Aaron Hernandez, right? So typically when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about negative attitudes, but it could be positive. It's just having some kind of belief or feeling or behavior towards someone because of their group membership. So going back to the affective component here, it says negative emotions are often ingrained and deeply ingrained. We ask ourselves, where does this affective prejudice come from? Maybe it comes from our parents, maybe it comes from society, from the media, from our peers, whatever the case may be. It's deeply ingrained in us that we have heard this maybe over and over again, and we start to believe it. And this makes our attitudes difficult to dispel. Like, how do you change your emotions? Like, if you find yourself feeling uncomfortable or angry towards someone because of their group membership, if you become aware of that, that's good because then you can change it, right? But how do you change that? I suppose the only answer I can think of would be just to spend more time around that person and get to know them more. Thinking about from the clinical psychology perspective, exposure therapy. The longer that you're around them, perhaps the more comfortable you'll be, or the more likely you will be to find common ground with them. But if you never spend time with these people, then you'll never know whether your beliefs are accurate or not. Your emotions may not change. So it's important for us to spend time with people who are different from us. But of course that's difficult because we talked last time about how important similarity is and how birds of a feather flock together. So we often have friends and have people in our lives who are very similar to us. So this is sometimes difficult. Now that behavioral component is just treating someone differently. So it's some kind of behavior, right? Which this says negative, once again, could be positive, but typically negative. An unjustified negative or harmful action toward the members of a group simply because of their membership in that group. So perhaps someone doesn't get a job because of their religious beliefs or their race or anything like that, right? They don't get a job. Other potential things with discrimination, we'll be talking about like sports teams versus if you have a certain team that you pull for. Sometimes fans get brutal. We talked a little bit during de-individuation. Like fans can attack each other just because you're wearing the other team's jersey at a football stadium. You attack somebody. I mean, it's insane sometimes how this happens. But discrimination is actually treating someone differently based on their group membership. Now, I said that sometimes it's hard to see the emotional, affective side of it. We can typically see discrimination, but we may not see it or we may not be aware of it. That sometimes it's kind of institutionalized, it's kind of written into the rules and the way that things are, and it's kind of a social norm sometimes, and that makes it difficult to see it sometimes, but usually if we look for it, we'll be able to find it. So we have discrimination as the behavioral aspect. The cognitive aspect is going to be a stereotype. Now, this is just a belief or a thought about a group of people. A generalization about a group of people in which identical characteristics are assigned to virtually all members of the group. So basically here, when you feel like if you've known one person in the group, you've known all of the people in this group, right? So you feel like you know them even though you don't. So a generalization means you're taking something that you see as true of one person or a small group of people and applying it to a larger group of people. So stereotypes develop when we have some kind of negative interaction perhaps with someone and we assume that it was because of whatever group membership that they're in that caused that behavior. Of course, typically we have no evidence to back that up, but once these stereotypes have been formed, they're very difficult to change. Remember when we talked about cognitive dissonance, we talked about the relationship between our behaviors and our beliefs. And oftentimes, once we have these beliefs, it's very difficult to change them. We tend to focus more on the information that supports our bias. Maybe we have all kinds of information that comes in that refutes our stereotype. We tend to just ignore that information or to discredit that information. But when we see information that supposedly confirms our stereotype, then we latch on to that. So this is just the way that we think because we don't want to be wrong. So we tend to look for information that supports our perspective that we already have. But this means that we may never get to know people that we could have great relationships with. So it's really unfortunate. So stereotyping is a cognitive process, not an emotional one. So we said there, the ABC, right, that the affective, emotional aspect is how you feel about the person. Stereotyping is a cognitive process. It's what you believe or think about the other person. Now, just because someone holds this belief about a group of people does not necessarily mean they will discriminate against them, right? It says it's a technique that we use to simplify the world. It's supposed to save us time and effort. If we are able, and that's just human nature, that we put things in categories. That's just the way that we do things. We put things in groups because it makes things easier for us, right? We do this in just about every category of life. The problem is, though, that this seemingly helpful way of simplifying our world can actually lead us to making a lot of mistakes, where if we feel like we know something about someone, we might not actually know anything about them at all. And also, we do know that there is a relationship between beliefs and behavior, and although the stereotype does not necessarily lead to some kind of discrimination, sometimes it does, and so we have to be careful with that, right? So, another example of stereotypes, and we said a stereotype was just a belief or a thought that you have about someone based on their group membership. One thing that we hear about a lot are gender stereotypes and gender norms. So we have these stereotypes or these beliefs about the way that women and men should be, right? We have these stereotypes that women are more socially sensitive, friendlier, and more concerned with the welfare of others. Now, it's probably, the origin of this stereotype is probably because women are the ones that carry and give birth to children and the ones that breastfeed and that kind of thing, and so we think of women as being nurturers because of that. That is potentially one thing. Also, because we have this stereotype, we tend to reinforce women for behaving this way and punish women for not behaving this way. So maybe it is perhaps that we have the stereotype set and we force other people to fit into it. Or maybe it's a stereotype because a majority of people fit into it. We may never know. We have the same kind of stereotype with men, that men tend to be more dominant, controlling, and independent, right? Now, then the question is this true of men? Is the stereotype a stereotype because it's true? Or is it that because we hold this stereotype, we expect men to behave in a certain way? I mean, we do see that there are differences between men and women, that men and women do have different abilities, and that they do have different opportunities, right? I once worked at a job where myself and a male coworker had the same job title, had the same supervisors. We were doing the same work. The only difference between the two of us was that I had a bachelor's degree and he did not yet have a bachelor's degree, and yet he was getting paid like $1 an hour more than me, which to me was crazy because I had a bachelor's degree and he did not, and yet he was getting paid more than me. Maybe that has to do with stereotypes. Maybe that was discrimination. Maybe I should have done something about it, but I didn't. Obviously, looking back on it, maybe I wish that I had, but we have these stereotypes that don't necessarily lead to discrimination, but sometimes they do, right? So when we're talking about these stereotypes of gender, this could really go either way, and we see both of these. Hostile sexism, this term used in the book, it says stereotypical views of women that suggest that women are somehow inferior to men. So there are a lot of cultures that hold this belief that women are kind of inferior, and perhaps even some in our culture as well, although I think maybe less than it used to be, looking at women as less intelligent, less competent. We don't have a lot of female leaders. We don't have a lot of female CEOs, that kind of thing. So hostile sexism, but we also see benevolent sexism, right? Stereotypical positive views of women. I think we talked about this earlier in the semester when we talked about the self, and we talked about gender a little bit there. And there was an activity where we talked about the benefits and the drawbacks of both men and women, like what they're good at and what they're not so good at. And typically, when I've done this activity several times in several classes, usually my students list more things that women are good at and more things that men are bad at, regardless of the gender of the student. Like, even the male students are praising women more than they do men. And I've always wondered why that is, if perhaps it's because you have a female teacher, and like, you're not going to offend me, I'm not going to judge you or whatever, or perhaps it's just that we've been taught to be polite, that we look down on people who mistreat women differently or more than we look down on people who mistreat men. I don't know. But sexism could go either way, where someone has stereotypically positive views of women with benevolent sexism, or stereotypical negative views of women with hostile sexism. But either way, it's a stereotype. Now I ask you, how are we going to study stereotypes? How are we going to do research? We started off this class with lectures on research because research is so important. But how do you measure prejudice? Well, most people don't want to just come right out and say that they have prejudice. It's difficult to research prejudice because A, people may not even be aware that they hold a certain prejudice, and B, these individuals, even if they are aware of it, are not likely to admit to it. We have this social desirability bias where we want to feel like we're good people, and so we don't necessarily just come right out with this, right? So a bogus pipeline is one way to do it, where participants are hooked up to something that they are told is a lie detector when it is actually not. It's actually nothing at all. But the idea here is because they believe that they're hooked up to a lie detector, then they're more likely to tell the truth, right? I can either be a racist and a liar, or I can just be a racist and be honest, right? So you have to decide there. So even though they're not hooked up to a lie detector, they think they are, so we're using deception here. The other thing that they use is an implicit attitudes test. Now, if you want to take these, you can find these online. You can just Google implicit attitudes test. The idea here is that it's looking for these attitudes that you're not even aware of. The way that it typically works is, well, if I tell you how it works, then it'll ruin your results, but I'm going to go ahead and explain it to you anyway, because I feel like you need to understand that if you have, typically if we're talking about, like, for example, a racial stereotype, then they'll have Caucasian individuals and African American individuals, and then they'll have positive words and negative words. So when maybe you first start, they will say, press this button if you see a Caucasian face or a positive word. Press this button if you see an African American face or a negative word. And then it will swap. It'll say, press this button if you see a Caucasian face or a negative word. Press this button if you see an African American face or a positive word. The idea is that if someone is prejudiced against one of those groups, then they will struggle. They'll be slower at hitting the button to associate those faces with positive words as well. But, of course, there are lots of problems with this. It's not necessarily super accurate, but there are problems with any kind of research on prejudice because people may not be aware of it or because they just don't want to talk about it, right? So perhaps the best way to try to figure out if someone has a prejudice or to figure out if you have a prejudice is to just observe your behavior. Because we may have these implicit attitudes or implicit prejudices that we're not even aware of, but that doesn't mean that they don't influence us. They absolutely do. So perhaps just by paying attention to the way someone acts, paying attention to the way someone treats other people, or the way that you treat other people, might just be the best way to try to understand your own prejudices, your own biases, right? And if you have any questions or comments about this material, please let me know, right? Okay. So, last thing we're going to talk about today, automatic and controlled processing of stereotypes. Sometimes we cannot control our thoughts that just automatically pop into our heads, right? Automatic processing of information we can't control. It may be that we have ingrained these stereotypes that we've learned from parents or from teachers or from the media or from whatever. They are ingrained in us and they automatically pop up in a certain situation. You can't necessarily control that. There's not really anything you can do to prevent that. However, controlled processing of information you have control over. So, maybe that prejudice becomes activated, you become aware of it, then you have an option. Now you can control this by saying, I am going to ignore or refute that stereotype. I feel myself having this belief about someone and I feel myself attributing it to some group membership. I'm actually going to go out and try to find out whether or not this is true. I'm going to go out and judge this person by the content of their character, right? I'm going to go find out more so that I'm not making a judgment based on group membership. So although we may not be able to help it when that bias or that prejudice is immediately activated, we can prevent ourselves from dwelling on it and acting on it, right? So sometimes just having this conversation where we talk about prejudice, it can help us be prepared to combat it in some ways. And we'll talk more next week about ways to fight prejudice. This is where I'm going to leave lecture for today, so we'll pick back up here next week. Remember, you do not have an activity, so just let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you guys later.